Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to let people trickle in for a few seconds. Okay, we'll get started. Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Nadeau. I am the Legal Education Director for the Labor and Employment section of the Florida Bar. We are here today to listen to Lynn Cole present on cultural competencies. Before we do that, just a couple quick announcements. On March 5th, we have our full day Zoom CLE. It's Litigation Skills and Technology. Registration is open. You can go register after we're done with this. The topics will include jury selection, mediations in a digital age, going paperless, AI, discovery disputes, using tech to bolster your case. And it's 9 CLE credits and 1 tech credit. So it's a good opportunity to get a bunch all at once. And then also I want you to save the date for our advanced labor topics. It's going to be in Duck Key, and it's April 25th and 26th, and we will have that registration open very soon. You can put it on your calendar now. But today we're here on expanding intercultural skills to resolve today's increasingly multicultural disputes. Lynn Cole is here to present to us. She has had a very successful career. After many years as a labor and employment litigator, she has devoted her practice to mediation and arbitration for the last 20 years or so. In addition to her extensive domestic practice, and the reason we're hearing from her today, Lynn has extensive experience as an international mediator in designing mediation systems in developing countries, and she teaches mediation here and abroad. Her resume is far too lengthy to recite here, and I know she has a lot to share, so I'm going to turn it over to her now. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that introduction. Just want to tell you all, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat room. Michelle's going to be watching those for me, and when we get about 3 or 4, she's going to give me a heads up, because I really like to answer questions as you go along so that you don't forget them. And yes, I do have a lot to say today. I want to show you the first screen, and I saw this grasshopper as I was going to the Hong Kong airport on my way to Indonesia to train mediation there. And this is a bank that was showing this, and I thought that was very odd. Why would a bank in this part of the world show a grasshopper? I wanted to show it to you because my first impression as an American was as a pest. But I want you to know that people from different parts of the world may see it as a pest, but they may also see it as a great appetizer. That is right, an aperitif. That's what they see it in Thailand. In some provinces in northern China, they see it as a pet. So just by this one thing, you can see the enormous differences based upon what you're learning from that one object. What's culture? At Bridges Academy, we train in intercultural skills, and we train in cultural dimensions, emotional intelligence, intercultural communications, and managing the mediation process. Today, I want to talk to you as lawyers about those same kind of skill sets. We won't be able to cover everything, but I want to give you an introduction to everything so that you get a sense that you may want to learn more about any one of those subjects. So most people think of culture as costume or food, different types of foods. But culture is very, very different. It is deeply ingrained in us from birth, and sometimes even before birth. It really is a collective programming of the mind, sharing systems of knowledge. Certainly communications, which also includes not just verbal, but nonverbal communications. It includes cultivated behaviors and a way of life. In short, it's a total sum of learned behavior, and it's learned behavior shared by generations. What's the contrast to culture? Well, cultural ethnocentrism is one such thing because culture is a broad, wonderful, diverse kind of thing. At least that's the way I look at it. But we may live in a culture, or others may live in the world in cultures where they look at their culture as being of a greater value, a higher standard than other cultures. They may look as their culture is vastly superior. They may do that because their culture, perhaps they view their culture through the lens of racism or sexism. Perhaps they even view it through the perspective of immigrant bias. That immigrants eat cats or dogs, and they are murderers and are all criminals, and they categorize them as being so much less than natives of that culture. So, for example, it might happen in our country right now. It might even be happening, except perhaps in terms of immigration, there may be no problem, for example, of South Africans immigrating into the United States. That may be a new thing that could happen soon. But that's what culture is. And what we teach and what I want to give you just a taste of today is intercultural skills. And I emphasize the word effective transmission of learned messaging priorities from members of one culture or social group to others. It's the exchanging of that culture or social group or society's ideas, information, and communications between people, and sometimes even among people of different cultures. I believe, and my belief is shared by many, that intercultural skills are no longer optional. We are living in a vastly, increasingly multicultural world. You as attorneys are operating in increasingly multicultural workplaces. And international business is very much becoming multicultural. We have diverse cultural environments. We have ethnic differences, which refers to the distinction between groups of people based on their cultural expression and identification. We have ethnicity, ethnic differences, not just ethical preferences, but ethnic differences, which is really a much broader concept than just race, and is often associated with national origin. And we have differences in social codes, the rules of behavior that are accepted by one group and not accepted by another. Intercultural skills are needed in the rapid expansion today of all kinds of litigations, particularly in business and international litigations, and in business and international negotiations and mediations. And this is happening worldwide. It's happening because across the world, there are fewer commercial transactions tied to national boundaries. When I started my mediation practice, I lived and worked abroad for over several different years. The first assignment I had overseas was with the American Bar Association and the rule of law. And I lived and worked in Bulgaria, helping them start their mediation practice, building actually their mediation rules and regulations for their court. And one of the things that was even happening in Bulgaria then, and even in the next country in which I lived, which was Kosovo, was fewer transactions tied to national boundaries. And I really saw that in the next country in which I worked. And actually, I lived in Jordan and worked there for the longest time because I went back and forth many times and lived there for almost over a year. I saw a lot of building and construction going on in Amman, which is the capital. The construction was being done by the Turks. There were other buildings going on that were built by other Arab countries. There was some Swedish building going on. And so all of these international construction and commercial activities are going on. And moreover, they're extending over longer periods of time because the complexity of business transactions is increasing. The complexity of banking transactions is increasing, and that requires longer and more time, especially if you're involved in litigation in any of these areas. We live in a time where there's a very difference of opinions of whether or not there's going to be climate change. The scientists say there is. I believe the scientists. And what's going to happen, if you believe them, is we may even be in a period where helping to stop climate change is going to be stalled for a while. That may then involve even a greater rapid increase in climate change ultimately. With climate change, we're going to see mass intercultural disruptions, because most of the climate change is going to be drought or it's going to be floods. Either of those two is going to cause food shortages. When you have food shortages, you're going to see desperate people crossing borders to live. So we're going to see a great deal, I believe, in the next decades of migration issues and issues with assimilation of migrants. And all of this is going to be happening in a world with diverse cultures, countries with different political instabilities, different countries with wildly fluctuating economic variables. And you're going to see immigrants coming with their own ideologies into countries with conflicting ideologies. How are we going to deal with that as attorneys? We're going to have to deal with it successfully. In our cultural world today, there are variables such as national versus regional, or perhaps even today in our country, national versus international. There's always has been and will continue to be variables expressed in religious views and transitions, in linguistic variables. By linguistic variable, I mean variable that uses words or phrases instead of numbers to represent values. So, for example, AI uses different numbers, but how we express AI may be different linguistically. One very simple example is a use in, let's say you're in a negotiation and somebody uses the word ain't. That word is associated with a less educated or a working class type of education. We're going to see gender treatment differences, variables in generational customs. I often wish, as I grow older, that we practice more of the Asian value of age. Generation isn't necessarily valued in our country, but it is valued for its wisdom in many other countries. And of course, there are social class norms and deviations. If we don't understand intercultural differences, if we don't accept them, if we try to avoid them, if we try to overlook them, if we try to ignore them, we won't be successful, not in the next decades coming. We have to understand, get a basic understanding that we must at least learn and understand and accept the difference in others when we work with them. Because if we don't, we can cause embarrassment among the parties, between the parties, or between ourselves as attorneys in the parties. We can cause confusion. We can cause increased sensitivities, and we can even cause offense. Let me give you some examples from a culture different than ours, an Indian culture. So, for example, pointing the index finger may be perceived as accusatory. Standing with your hands on your hips, which we do in America oftentimes, may be seen in India as aggressive or dominating. Keeping your hands folded in your pockets while you're talking can often be seen as arrogant. whistling or winking. These can be actions seen as rude and are often very unacceptable in various aspects of the Indian culture. Pointing your feet at people. In many, much of the Hindu culture, in the predominant culture, religious culture in India, feet are considered unclean. So it's best to avoid pointing at them, at people. Touching people with objects with your feet or shoes is very definitely, generally unaccepted in the Indian culture. And so using your left hand for monetary transactions to give offerings is very different from the Hindu transition, the pujas using their right hand. Touching someone on the top of their head. In our culture, a pat on the head is an act of gentleness and kindness and acceptance. But it's not so, because in India, in many parts of its culture, in the vast majority of the populace, it's not appropriate, because the head is considered the holiest part of the body. So that's just one example of hundreds and hundreds, because every society has its different cultures, which are inbred into the individuals. Now, let me also give you a very strong caveat at this point. When we are talking about culture, we are not talking about individuals. We're not even talking about individuals within that culture. We're not even talking about individuals within that culture. I'm sorry, I thought I'd turn my cell phone off. Let me turn that off real quick. We're not even talking about individuals within that culture. We're talking about societies, and I'll give you a little bit more of that definition as we talk about cultural dimensions shortly. But even cultures are evolving, which is an interesting and fascinating subject to see. So, as attorneys in today's multicultural legal environments, our question is not how to help others become aware of their cultural limitations, but look at it from this perspective. Look at it from a perspective how to discover overlaps, common issues, and common assets. I want to move into a little bit now about what we train at an overview, a very quick overview, to be honest with you, of subjects we train at Bridges Academy. Bridges stands for Building Resolutions for Disputes Globally with E-Learning Strategies. We like to say that we take the I out of Bridges to develop a more intercultural you. So we teach both knowledge, but mostly and predominantly skills. And the first course we teach, which is about knowledge, is cultural dimensions and multicultural perspectives. Then we train you about self-awareness through emotional intelligence. And we train about preparing and managing the intercultural legal process and intercultural communications. If we take a look first at knowledge, it's important to understand that the study of culture is a very relatively new study. It is a study, and people are actually getting advanced degrees in culture. It goes back to the late 1990s to a scientist called Gert Hofstede, and he studied through multiple worldwide business surveys, and he drew from those surveys different frameworks to understand culture, or dimensions to understand culture. He developed these ability to, through a recognized theory, to understand culture-shaped norms and expectations, to show the similarities generally and differences between the cultures, not individuals, cultures. If you look at the bottom, you see some things like power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. All of these are different cultural dimensions that can be studied individually. And it's quite an interesting study of each of those differences within cultures. But today, we're only going to talk about the knowledge part of it. I mentioned to you that cultural and the study of culture is a relatively new advanced study and profession. It is relatively new, and it comes in its origin from basically anthropology and now includes psychology. But I wanted to add today for you this new aspect, which I am currently studying all the time, and that is cultural neuroscience. Cultural neuroscience now today is an interdisciplinary field, and it studies the cultural influences on the brain. Primarily what they're doing is using the magnetic MRIs, and they're studying individuals from one culture versus another culture by showing each the same type of cultural inducing questions and answers. And through this, they're finding that through these neurobiology experience and questions and answers, they're finding that through the brain has, based upon culture, different brain activities. In other words, if you're from one culture, a question on that culture may produce a stimulus different from the person sitting next to you having a different stimulus in the brain. It's a fascinating thing to study. And it's a leading cutting edge study right now of how culture shapes and our psychological and neurobiological functions. Knowledge includes, as I mentioned, cultural dimensions. I said frameworks before, power distance index, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, which, by the way, I would say from my studies in the last 10 to 12, 15 years on this, is probably of the dimensions, it is the most evolving one. I can say that with some assurance and positivity. The uncertainty avoidance index, long-term orientation versus short-term indulgence versus restraint. We're not going to get into any one of those because any one of those would be at least a couple of hours, probably more, to understand them. But I just mentioned them because having multicultural perspectives for you as an attorney can be very important for you to hone your ability to recognize others' culturally shaped perspectives or behaviors and how they apply those behaviors to different events. How to manage ambiguities, because sometimes when you're with a person from a different culture, they may have a confused look on their face by something you say and vice versa. And from that, unless you clarify or ask questions, mistakes can emerge from those cross-cultural differences. Being sensitive to your parties and other parties' perceptions as the attorney about how you say it and what you do. That's what knowledge is about, and gaining that knowledge is important. We offer a number of different skills to help you understand and practice intercultural awareness. The first skill that we offer is emotional intelligence. If I could see all of you, I would ask you to raise your hands or to give an indication that at least Michelle could, if she could see your hands raised. How many of you know what emotional intelligence is, and how many of you practice it? That you think you at least practice it. Emotional intelligence is, of course, being aware of one's own emotions, which drive your behavior. And by driving your behavior, you can see through your own emotional intelligence how that impacts others, either positively or negatively. Once you're able to see that, you're able to judge how to either react, change, or continue with that line of thinking or talk. Emotional intelligence really can be a very important skill in the workplace, because today's workplace is including vastly increased numbers of people from different cultures. We have immigration, but we do have a high degree of integration for certain skills. So we may have in the higher skill sets in doctors, in psychologists, in scientists, we may have higher skill sets. And in those people coming in, the cultural differences are just as a variable as they are in everyday life. Emotional intelligence in practical terms, and that's what we learn, and it's taught by a course of two of our, we have a very international faculty in Bridges Academy. Two of our faculty members, both of whom teach at Columbia University. It shows being aware, as I mentioned, of your own emotions, which drive your own behaviors and impact people. I'd like to say that again for you. It's very important. It's also recognizing and appropriately responding to the emotions of others. And sometimes when you don't understand those emotions of others, knowing that you don't and asking a question to help you better understand rather than making an assumption based upon your own culture. It can result in building effective communication and positive relationships. And I have done many courses in corporations, and I continue to do that for multicultural international corporations who want to have this kind of skill set learning within their workplace. Self-awareness is really important because it allows you to view not just your experiences through your own ego, but through the cultural lenses of other people. To understand, it helps you understand signs of surprise, and when you see it, to understand that it's not necessarily a reaction to you, it's their own way of thinking to that stimuli or what is being said. When you see body language of discomfort, you don't have to know that you have immediately caused that, but understand that that person, that you're unaware of that same reaction that they're having as a cultural reaction, but you can talk about it and communicate about it. The same thing goes with expressions of just judgment. In intercultural communications and work, nonverbal is extremely important. It is most of, sorry about that, folks. It is most, I keep thinking of turning my power off and it's not going off. So let me try this one more time. And my apologies. All right, so the next slide. Power off. All right, so the next slide is strategies. It allows, by the way, we call emotional intelligence EQ, and you develop strategies for it in our courses. You learn how to prepare in advance to avoid surprises, because when you understand certain cultural, not your own culture, but other cultural norms, you can avoid surprises. So if, for example, you are about to go into a mediation, and in the mediation, the other party is, for example, from Korea, or you might understand that, and you can easily find out what some of the general cultural traits are for that culture, so that if that person happens to exhibit that behavior, you're not surprised by it. You can also adapt strategies for reestablishing your own self-balance. You don't have to be surprised. You don't have to be taken aback, and you don't have to own it, but simply learn from it and ask questions and educate yourself to cope with potential cultural ambiguities. One of the things we do at Bridges Academy is we have a final simulation, intercultural simulation. And we have parties acting as different through their culture, acting that part interculturally in their role play. I did that one time as a Japanese fisherman, and the mediator was American. And a couple of things happened. First of all, acting as a Japanese fisherman, and being humble. And when our mediator said something, I smiled and shook my head. Another time when the mediator asked something, I said nothing, just simply smiled. Because in that culture, shaking your head does not necessarily mean that you're agreeing. It means, yes, I hear you. I am gratified and I hear you. Not saying anything is not a sign that they don't hear you. It's a sign of respect in many cultures. So these are little things that you can learn about before you even go into a multicultural situation, and understand that the unfamiliar practices can be contrary to your experience and not be surprised or off balanced by them. The other thing we teach is preparation and managing the legal skills process, intercultural skills in the legal process. Again, pre-plan your appropriate processes with possible collateral meetings and individual research. I do international mediations and arbitrations. That is my other job. I'm a full-time mediator and arbitrator. I have had and have currently different intercultural arbitrations. I study that culture before I do anything and call any meeting or hold any meeting as an arbitrator. I do likewise as a mediator. And even as a mediator, I always have pre-mediation meetings, particularly if there's going to be any cultural differences that might show or be made aware of, you're made aware of during the mediation or negotiation. I always recommend to the attorneys and to other mediators, have your pre-mediation meeting. Make sure they understand the concepts, because for many cultures, the concepts of mediation are very new or very nuanced, and it's not easy for them to understand. That pre-mediation is extremely important. There may be more parties at stake in multicultural mediation, multicultural legal processes than you're normally aware of to begin with. For example, if you've got a client or a workplace issue that involves people from either India or China or Korea or Taiwan, for example, you may want to learn the general characteristics of that culture, because in those cultures, there is a hierarchy. One of the cultural dimensions in those cultures is the hierarchy. That is, you have the habit of not making the decision oneself, but referring it to the higher being, the person above you, to whom you owe great respect. You have to be adaptable to those circumstances, and they are varied in many. Let me say it again, be adaptable to the circumstances. Whether you work together with others to design a procedure, and that's the best way to do it, to work with not only your client, but the attorney with other clients in multicultural environments, to make sure you're meeting the needs of the parties in terms of mutual respect, balancing their autonomy, because their sense of autonomy, and varies greatly in different cultures, their affiliation and their time allocations. Time allocations also relate to religion. If, for example, you have you're having a negotiation, for example, or a mediation, workplace mediation with someone of Muslim descent, make sure that your client knows that other person may ask for a break because prayers are important to them, and the timing of those prayers is important to them. Those are the kinds of things, just among hundreds of different things, that you can learn to anticipate. So we need to also learn how to manage the client process. Be watchful. Sometimes you may not be aware of one's cultural background. Their English may be fine. They may have lived here for a while. They may not practice as much in their culture as they may be assimilated into the American culture or another culture. But here are things you can do as an attorney to be aware and watchful for those intercultural differences. There are signposts of progress or impediments that are not obvious. Watch for them. You may need to be less directive and more facilitative because of mutual sensitivities of your client or other parties. In other words, please try and adapt your approach so that you can be better heard and understood by the person from another culture as they listen to you. It's important in terms of client expectations in multicultural situations, legal ones, to make sure that your client understands what to expect. There's, in my view, it's a better practice, particularly in a multicultural situation, to focus on that and make sure that your client is understanding something. And you may think that they are because they're shaking their head. But if that client is from Taiwan or Korea, it may simply be shaking their head because they are simply saying, yes, I understand that you're saying something. I hear you. But you may want to ask the further question and have a dialogue with them to make sure that they understand. Setting action items in a multicultural situation is more important, and I believe, than in non, although I think it's important for all clients, but especially important because of their views of time, their views of how decisions and with whom and by whom decisions are made, making sure that your party in the room is the person who's actually going to make the decision or can make the decision. Those are skills you want to do and learn in managing your client process. Communications is a huge and vast field. I know that because I teach intercultural communications, and I learn something every time I teach the course. And then I have to figure out, how do I include that in the course and still keep the time the same? There are extraordinary nuances in communication styles. The first question I ask of any new class is this question: what is the most important aspect of communication? Come February 22nd, Bridges Academy will be training 25 students, either bachelor's degree graduates, master's or doctoral degree in psychology or sociology from the University of Kyiv. And we'll be doing that training online. And what we have to do is, what we've had to do in our international faculty, is recognize those cultural differences in Ukraine. Most importantly, in Ukraine, and the first question I'm going to ask them is, what is the most important aspect of communication? I'd like to see your hands if I could see them raised. How many of you said listening? Listening is the most important aspect of communication. And for us, while we're training Ukrainians who are fairly adept in the English language, we also have to be aware that their communication skills are very different than ours. That's the first thing. The second thing I'm going to be teaching them initially is the trauma-informed communication. Every single citizen in Ukraine now has either lost a loved one or close loved one or someone, a friend of their loved one, or a family member has been injured or wounded in the army. This country has suffered immensely from the war perpetrated by Putin onto them. Unlike what the President of the United States just said, Ukraine did not start that war. Unlike what the President of the United States just said, Zelensky is not a dictator because they have been unable to hold elections during the war. So communications are vast and different, and we'll be talking to them and teaching them in a trauma-informed way so that we can better communicate and they can better listen. There are many styles and variations to communications. I'm going to be speaking for about another 10, about 5 to 10 more minutes, and then we'll take some questions and answers. But communication is not just about speaking different languages. There are multiple factors involved in intercultural communications that contribute to meaning making. Meaning making, what is that? It's a cognitive process where individuals interpret, understand, and assign significances to their life experiences, events, relationship, and the world in which they live. Essentially, communication is creating a coherent narrative of their lives by making active sense of their own reality. Communication styles vary enormously. And this is just in the verbal part. I won't even be able to get with you today on the nonverbal part, which is actually a lot of fun to learn. What I'm going to do today is to choose from one of these variables. I'm going to choose from the one called direct versus indirect. And I'm choosing that one because I think it's easier to understand. And I see it more often than not between different cultures than I do some of the other variables, although verbal and nonverbal is also a big one, and formal and informal is as well, particularly in the Western versus the Eastern cultures. Formal versus informal has some very different communication styles that you can learn fairly easily. But for today, and this will be the end, last part of my talk before we get into questions and answers. For today, we'll take a look at direct versus indirect. Direct communicators. All right. I think you're going to recognize a lot of these because I think for the most part, as a culture, although we are a very young culture, by the way, but even as a young culture, we have adopted as a culture generally direct communications. The Australians have adopted direct communications. Canada is also a country that tends to, as a culture, express themselves directly. So that says telling people what you think. It means an attempt to convince others that you are right. And that doesn't mean aggressively, or it can be done in many different ways, positively and not positively. It means you tend to use clear, definitive statements, that you participate actively in meetings for the most part. And I'm talking now a lot about business and workplace, labor and employment. And you tend to make your points with conviction. With verbal communicators, we are verbal. As direct communicators, we are verbal. We are not apt or prone to silence. We are not prone to holding back our thoughts or thinking as a culture. The indirect communicators do hold back. They're more likely to observe, to ask questions and present possibilities. So what does that mean for you if you're going into a mediation with someone from a culture that you think has a very indirect mode? It's really important because that person, again, may be on the other party may not be as expressive as your client. It doesn't mean that they don't have as much to say or they don't have as deep or confirmed belief system. They just don't express themselves more openly. They ask questions. They tend to present possibilities. They tend to work in they tend to view life as a shared experience with family and friends versus the more individualistic approach, which tends to be Western and the more direct style. They do ask a lot of questions and they offer suggestions. And there's often, they want discussions rather than being told what to do. And they tend to use words that are not black or white, that are open to subtleties. They ask others to consider their ideas. And they are often silent, not as an expression of arrogance or disagreement, but as respect. I just want to say one thing about one experience that I had. I started Bridges Academy because after I finished my last assignment with USAID in Sri Lanka, I was pretty well convinced that there was nobody teaching intercultural skills. I had tried as hard as I could to learn about the first country I went to, Bulgaria, the second one, Kosovo, the third, Jordan, and the last, Sri Lanka. I could learn all about their trade, what their trade was, how much they imported and exported. I could learn about how many men, women, and children. I could learn about their demographics and their population. I could learn about the climate. I could learn all those things, but nobody was teaching the differences of intercultural communications. So the first, and before I went to Bulgaria, my first assignment with, as I said, American Bar Association for the Rule of Law, the next morning, a huge meeting of all of the heads of NGOs in that country were there at that meeting. And I walked in and I introduced myself. I at least knew how to say Blagodaria, which is thank you and good morning. I learned those words. And most spoke English, and they asked me a question, and I said yes. And laughter erupted around the room. And I could feel my face getting red, but I didn't know why. But I smiled. And my liaison from Bulgaria looked at me and she said, "It's okay." She said, "This means no, and this means yes in Bulgaria." I wish I could have known that before I went there, but nobody was teaching these skills. Nobody was thinking about them, 15 years ago when I started out as a mediator. So when I got to Kosovo, I had a better idea of what to look for. When I got to Jordan, I studied more, but I still made mistakes because I hadn't been I was not as adept at understanding the Muslim traditions, especially among women, as I could have been if I had known how to study it more. Because Muslim women, the women with whom I worked in the office, tended to talk indirectly amongst themselves, not to others. My style of being open and honest and looking directly in one's eyes was not well accepted initially in Jordan. So back to direct and indirect communications. So these are not necessarily things, and believe me, these are not individual things. They are just different styles and variables associated with a culture. So in one culture, truth is more important than sparing one's feelings. But in another culture, if the truth hurts, you either avoid saying it or you soften it or say it in a kind way. In some cultures, we may be very familiar with this, which is say what you mean and mean what you say, but with other cultures, they don't. They read between the lines. Their words have greater meanings. The way in which they say it has greater meanings. The tone in which they say it, the speed with which they say it, the intervals of silence with which they say it has different meanings. Saving face is huge. We don't talk much about that in our country. We do it some, but in other countries, it is huge. It is very, very important. It has to do with the deep sense of hierarchy within certain cultures and the deep sense of never wanting to shame someone because people believe in operating as some people as a group mentality, a societal mentality. In our country, it may be okay, or in Australia or Canada, to disagree in a meeting with your boss. That may not happen frequently or as frequently, and certainly not in the same way if you're doing an online meeting with a group from the same company in Korea or Japan or Taiwan. There, you may not have that kind of disagreement. You're not probably going to see it. What you're going to see is, if there is criticism, it's not going to be open and direct of those in authority, because those in authority are usually, that criticism would be carefully veiled or not even spoken at that point. It's not handled that way in a group as it would be in our society. Okay, we're about at the end, and I wanted to give you all, I could talk forever, but I wanted to give you all some time to ask some questions. And I hope we have a few in the chat room. I like questions best because I also learn from your questions. But my last message to you is this. We can live in a society, in a culture that devolves, or we can live in a society that evolves. We can live in a society that does not like differences, that does not like disagreement, that does not want others above you to be disagreed with. Or we can live with a society in which we accept diversity, where we're curious about how others live, where we find the energy from others in their differentness. When we can learn how, as we must if we don't, as our generation, then our children and grandchildren will have to learn the process of acculturization, not defacement, not contempt for the difference in others, but acculturization, accepting others from a different culture into your cultures, accepting that they will continue their practice, but also that they are learning to accept yours and to be aware of yours and to honor yours, and vice versa. That is the process of evolving. And it is my pleasure to share it with you today. Shell, do we have any questions?
So we have one question. We have a quiet group today.
Quiet. Okay.
It's a long question, but I can read it to you. When speaking to crowds, which tend to be multicultural, how do you decide which aspects of certain cultures to incorporate in such a speech, which to omit, as some can clash or not translate well, or may be taken in offensive ways by other questions? Growing up, we learned about code switching, which seems like switching between different cultural modes of communication. So the question is, how do you decide which aspects to include to be an effective speaker to multiple different cultures?
That is a question that is, each situation is going to deserve different study. Let me give you an example. There was a young man who was coming up in an organization, and the organization had different components in Japan and in Taiwan and in Australia and the United States. It was a multicultural business, and he was young, and he had been asked to speak at this audience, to this Japanese audience. He was thrilled. He was excited. He was exuberant. He got there, took off his jacket, he rolled up his sleeves, and he talked to them as if they were, just good friends as well, because that's the way he had been successful. When he finished, and his audience of Japanese men, mostly men, some women, very properly and formally dressed, got up and left without answering questions, he felt very deflated. And the reason why is because he did not study his audience before he did that. First of all, in this environment, this was a formal audience. To take off your shirt, your jacket, and roll up your sleeves does not mean you're being friendly. It means you are diminishing your audience. So these are the kinds of things you have to look at when you are talking to a multicultural audience. Here's what I do as a sort of a preference, a pre-statement. I know and honor that we have you from different cultures today. I will try and learn about your culture, but I will need your help. And so what I have to say today, I may not say in a way that you can best hear me, but I want to learn how to hear you best. Here's what I have to, but I would use that, I do that as a preference. Because to me, I'm honoring our differences, number one. Number two, I'm telling them that I don't just put myself above them. And number three, what I'm saying is I'm curious and I want to learn, which is an honor to people. So that is the thing that I would do first as a preference to your multicultural audience.
Okay, the other question is very similar. It says, when mediating with persons of varying cultures, which culture do you focus on?
Both, all. Okay, and here's how you do it. I'm not sure if your question means that your client is from a different culture, or the other side has different cultures, or there are multiple parties, each with different cultures. I'm going to take the third option. So first of all, I would meet with your own client and find out what the culture is of, let's say you have two or more other parties. Find out the culture of each of those. And I would learn a little bit about them, and I can give you websites to give you those overviews quickly. But what I do is let's say your client is American, and what you need to say is, this is going to be very different than what we've experienced before, because we're going to be negotiating with a party that doesn't think the way we do, that has not been raised the way we do, that doesn't have the same cultural values that we do. Now, we're going to find that out, but there may be those cultural differences, and we want to avoid those stumbling blocks in the very beginning. So that's what you're saying to your client. Then you get to the other attorneys and you say, have you met with your party from Japan? Or have you met with your party from New Zealand? Or have you met with your party from Peru? Because they may have, and if the answer is yes, then you can say, how can we better communicate with this person? What have you learned that that can help us better communicate? I think you have to create that kind of dialogue between your attorneys, and hope that they too have done what you're doing, which is to interview your client to find out what his or her thinking is, and where the confusion can occur, and what misinterpretations can be avoided.
Okay, that's all the questions I've got here.
All right.
We're right at 1 o'clock, so it's actually perfect timing.
Good. Well, thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure. And like I said, Michelle, thanks for having me. Every time I do this, I learn something. So namaste, and good luck to your evolution.
Thank you, everyone. And the CLE number is 8911. I did put it in the chat, so hopefully people saw it, but it's 8911. So we will see you all next time. Remember, March 5th is the Litigation and Technology Skills CLE, so please sign up for that.
Thank you. Bye-bye.